The splash echoed across the concrete as Luke Matthews hit the water, his cannonball sending ripples through the community pool. Children shrieked with delight. Parents smiled from their lounge chairs. And, for a moment, everything felt perfect in the Westfield Heights community. But perfection, Luke would soon learn, was a fragile thing that could shatter with the sound of heavy boots on wet pavement. "You kid in the pool!" The voice cut through the afternoon laughter like a blade. Officer Bradley Morse of the Homeowners Association Security Force stood at the pool's edge, his uniform crisp despite the summer heat, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. Beside him, Officer Janet Sterling crossed her arms, her expression as cold as the pool water suddenly felt against Luke's skin. Luke treaded water, confusion clouding his 14-year-old features. "Me!" His voice cracked slightly, the way voices do when childhood meets uncertainty. "Yes. You... get out. Now." Morse's tone brooked no argument, though Luke couldn't understand what argument there could possibly be. He'd paid his day pass, followed all the posted rules, and hadn't caused any trouble. The confusion turned to a knot of anxiety in his stomach as he swam to the pool's edge. Water dripped from Luke's dark hair as he pulled himself out, his swim trunks clinging to his larger frame. He reached for his towel, but Sterling stepped forward, blocking his path. "Don't even think about getting comfortable. Son." The word son dripped with condescension that made Luke's cheeks burn. Around the pool, conversations had stopped. Parents were sitting up in their chairs, children pausing their games to stare. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over whispered something to her husband, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "I don't understand," Luke said, his voice smaller now. "What did I do wrong?" Morse pulled out a clipboard, his movements deliberate and official. Community Health Standard 47B, enacted this month. Your physical condition poses a potential health hazard to other residents. The words hit Luke like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around him, the whispers grew louder. Someone gasped. A child asked their parent what was happening, and the parent shushed them harshly. "That's..." Luke's voice found itself again, stronger this time. "That's not a real rule. You can't kick someone out for how they look." Sterling laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the pool's concrete walls. "Oh, it's very real, kid, and very enforceable. This is a private community with standards to maintain." Luke's hands shook as he reached again for his towel. This time, Morse grabbed his wrist. "I said don't get comfortable. You're coming with us." "Let go of me." Luke tried to pull away, but Morse's grip tightened. The man was easily twice Luke's size, his years of security work evident in his muscled frame. Resisting an HOA officer. Sterling smirked, pulling out her own radio. "That's another violation. Control. This is Unit 12. We have a Code 15 situation at the community pool. Requesting backup for escort and processing." The radio crackled to life. "Copy. Unit 12. Backup en route." Luke's world began to spin. This couldn't be happening. An hour ago, he'd been excited about spending his summer afternoon at the pool, maybe meeting some kids from the neighborhood, practicing his swimming. Now he was being treated like a criminal for simply existing in his own body. "Please," he whispered, hating how his voice sounded so young, so scared. "I just want to go home." "You should have thought about that before violating community standards," Morse said, beginning to pull Luke toward the pool's exit. "Your family will be receiving a full report and appropriate fines." The word fines sent another wave of panic through Luke. His mother worked so hard, picking up extra cases to pay for their small house in this neighborhood. She'd been so proud when they could finally afford to move to Westfield Heights, talking about the good schools and safe community. Now Luke was going to cost her money. And for what? For swimming while fat. As they walked through the pool area, Luke could feel every eye on him. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few showed the kind of satisfied smugness that suggested they approved of what was happening. Mrs. Patterson, whose own son was rail-thin and mean-spirited, nodded approvingly at the officers. "This is harassment," Luke said, his voice growing stronger as his shock gave way to anger. "You can't do this to people." "Watch us," Sterling replied. Reaching the pool's exit gate, 2 more officers were approaching from the parking lot, their uniforms identical to Morse and Sterling's, their expressions equally cold. Luke had always been a smart kid. Honor roll every semester, debate team captain, the kind of student teachers loved having in class. He understood rules and systems, believed in fairness and justice. But nothing in his 14 years had prepared him for this moment, when those concepts crumbled around him like sandcastles in a tide. Officers Thompson and Rivera. Morse nodded to the approaching backup. "We need escort assistance for a Code 15 violation." Officer Thompson, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked Luke up and down with undisguised disgust. Jesus, how did he even fit through the gate? The comment hit Luke like a slap. He'd heard worse at school. Of course, kids could be cruel. But this was an adult, an authority figure, someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. The betrayal felt almost worse than the humiliation. "Look, there's been a mistake." Luke tried again, his voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I live here. My mom is Laura Matthews. We live at 247 Maple Drive." "We know exactly who you are," Rivera said, consulting his own clipboard. "Luke Matthews, age 14, son of single mother Laura Matthews, resident since March. Your file says your mother works long hours downtown." The way he said "single mother" made it sound like a disease. Luke's jaw clenched. His mother had worked twice as hard as anyone to get where she was, to provide for them both after his father left when Luke was 7. She deserved respect, not whatever sneering judgment these officers were passing. "My mother is going to hear about this," Luke said. Trying to summon authority, he didn't feel... Sterling laughed again. "I'm sure she will, right after she gets the bill for today's violations. Let's see." She made a show of checking her clipboard. "Violation of Community Health Standard 47B, $200. Resisting an HOA officer, $150. Disruption of community peace, $75. That's $425 total." Luke's blood turned to ice. $425. He knew exactly how much that was to his family. That was groceries for a month. That was the payment on his mother's car. That was the difference between keeping their heads above water and drowning in debt. "You can't fine someone for being fat," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're not fining you for being fat," Morse said with mock patience. "We're fining you for violating clearly posted community health and safety standards. Big difference. Legally speaking." The 4 officers formed a loose circle around Luke as they moved toward the parking lot. Other residents had come out of their houses now, drawn by the commotion. Luke recognized some of them, the Johnsons from next door. The elderly Mr. Fitzgerald, who always waved when Luke walked by. The teenage girl who sometimes babysat for the younger kids on the street. Their stares felt like physical weight on Luke's shoulders. Some looked shocked, some confused, some satisfied. A few looked away entirely, as if the scene was too uncomfortable to watch. Luke understood. It was easier to look away than to get involved. Easier to pretend this wasn't happening than to risk becoming a target themselves. "Where are you taking me?" Luke asked as they reached the parking lot. "HOA headquarters for processing," Thompson replied. "Standard procedure for code violations requiring escort." Luke had never been to the HOA headquarters. It was a squat, beige building at the edge of the community, the kind of place you drove past without really seeing. Now it loomed in his vision like a prison. As they approached the officer's vehicle, a white SUV with Westfield Heights Community Security emblazoned on the side, Luke made one last desperate attempt. "Can I at least call my mom?" "After processing," Morse said, opening the rear door. "Get in!" The seat was hot vinyl that stuck to Luke's damp skin. The doors locked with an ominous click, and Luke felt the full weight of his powerlessness settle over him. Through the tinted windows, he could see more residents gathering, their faces blurred, but their attention clear. Word was spreading through the community like wildfire. The drive to HOA headquarters took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Luke stared out the window at the neighborhood he'd been so excited to call home just months ago. The neat lawns and matching mailboxes that had once seemed welcoming now felt oppressive, like a facade hiding something ugly underneath. The HOA building was exactly as uninspiring up close as it had been from a distance. Beige walls, small windows, and a parking lot filled with official vehicles. A sign by the entrance proclaimed, "Westfield Heights, a community of excellence." Luke wondered what their definition of excellence was. Inside, the building was all fluorescent lights and industrial carpet. The walls were covered with laminated notices about community standards, meeting schedules, and violation procedures. Luke's eyes caught on one particular notice: Community Health Initiative, maintaining our standards for all residents. The document was dated just 2 weeks ago. "Sit." Sterling pointed to a hard plastic chair facing a desk. Luke sat, acutely aware of how the chair creaked under his weight, how the officers exchanged glances. Morse settled behind the desk and pulled out a thick folder. "Luke Matthews, this is your official violation hearing. You have the right to explain your actions, though I should warn you that denial or excuses will only add to your penalty total." "What actions?" Luke's voice was hoarse now. "I went swimming." "That's it. I paid for a day pass, and I went swimming." "You violated Community Health Standard 47B by presenting a health hazard to other residents." Thompson read from her own paperwork. "This standard requires all residents using community facilities to maintain a body mass index within acceptable parameters." Luke's jaw dropped. "You're requiring people to have a certain BMI to use the pool?" "Among other facilities, yes," Rivera nodded. "It's a matter of community safety and maintaining property values." "That's discrimination," Luke said, his voice growing stronger. "That's illegal." Sterling smiled coldly. "It's community standards. Kid, your family agreed to abide by all HOA rules when you moved in. This is just a new rule, democratically approved by the community board." Luke thought about the community board meetings his mother had mentioned trying to attend, but never having time for due to her work schedule. Had this really been voted on? Had the neighbors he'd waved to really sat in a room and decided that people like him didn't belong in their pool? "I want to call my mother," Luke said again. "After we finish processing," Morse replied, not looking up from his paperwork. "Now, let's discuss the additional violations you accumulated during your escort." For the next 30 minutes, Luke sat in that uncomfortable chair while 4 adults systematically dismantled his sense of justice and fairness. They read him violations he'd supposedly committed, fines that would burden his family, and Community standards that seemed designed specifically to exclude people like him. Through it all, Luke found himself thinking about his mother, Laura Matthews, who worked 60-hour weeks to give them a better life, who had saved for 2 years to afford the down payment on their house, who made his lunch every morning before her own breakfast, who helped with homework despite being exhausted, who told him every day that he was smart and kind and worthy. What would she think when she heard about this? Would she blame herself for not being able to afford a house in a better neighborhood? Would she regret the move to Westfield Heights? Would she look at Luke differently? See him as the burden these officers clearly believed him to be? The thought of disappointing his mother hurt worse than all the humiliation and fear combined. "Phone call," Luke said when Morse finally finished with the paperwork. "I want my phone call now." Sterling gestured to an old phone on a side table. "Local calls only. 5 minutes." Luke's hands shook as he dialed his mother's work number. She answered on the second ring, her voice professional and crisp. "Laura Matthews, State Attorney's Office." "Mom." Luke's voice broke on the word, all his carefully maintained composure crumbling. "Luke, sweetheart, what's wrong? You sound upset." "I'm at the HOA building. They arrested me at the pool. They said I'm a health hazard, and they fined us over $400, and I don't understand what's happening." The words tumbled out in a rush. Fear and confusion, making him sound even younger than his 14 years. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When his mother spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the warm, concerned parent. In its place was something Luke had never heard before. Something cold and sharp and very, very dangerous. "Say that again, Luke, slowly." Luke repeated what had happened, his voice steadier now that he had his mother's attention. He could hear her taking notes, could almost see her switching into the mode that made her one of the most feared prosecutors in the state. "Luke, listen to me very carefully," Laura said when he finished. "Do not say another word to those officers. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. I am leaving right now, and I will be there in 20 minutes. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good boy. And Luke, you did absolutely nothing wrong. Nothing. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." "I love you, sweetheart. This is going to be okay." Luke hung up the phone and turned back to the officers, who had been listening with obvious amusement. "My mother's coming," he said simply. "Of course she is," Morse chuckled. "Probably wants to negotiate payment terms for the fines. We get a lot of that." Luke said nothing. He returned to his plastic chair and waited, thinking about the tone in his mother's voice. He'd heard her use that voice on the phone with work colleagues, had caught glimpses of it when she practiced arguments for important cases. But he'd never heard it directed at people who had hurt him. For the first time since this nightmare began, Luke felt a flicker of hope. 18 minutes later, the HOA building's front door opened with enough force to make the glass rattle. Laura Matthews strode into the lobby like an avenging angel, her heels clicking against the industrial flooring with the rhythm of machine gun fire. She was still in her courtroom attire, a sharp black suit that made her look taller than her 5'6" frame. Her dark hair pulled back in a style that framed her face like armor. Luke had always thought his mother was beautiful, but now she looked magnificent in a way that made the fluorescent-lit lobby suddenly feel too small to contain her. "Where is my son?" The question was directed at the room in general, but her eyes were fixed on Officer Morse with laser intensity. "Ma'am, if you could just take a seat. We can discuss the situation in a calm, rational manner," Morse began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone Luke was beginning to recognize as his default setting. Laura's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Officer Morse, isn't it? Let me save us both some time. I am Assistant State Attorney Laura Matthews, and you have approximately 30 seconds to explain why my minor child was detained without a parent or guardian present. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sterling and Thompson exchanged glances. Rivera shifted uncomfortably, and Morse's confident demeanor flickered like a candle in a strong wind. This is a community standards issue. Sterling stepped forward, apparently deciding to take point. Your son violated HOA regulations and was processed according to standard procedures. Standard procedures, Laura repeated, her voice deadly quiet. And these standard procedures include detaining a minor without parental notification, interrogating him without representation, imposing financial penalties without due process. Now look here. Morse found his voice again, standing up from behind his desk. This is an HOA matter, not a state issue. You have no jurisdiction here. Laura's laugh was like ice cracking. I have no jurisdiction, Officer Morse. I prosecute civil rights violations for the state of Pennsylvania. I have jurisdiction anywhere a citizen's constitutional rights are being violated. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. And, speaking of jurisdiction, I'm very curious about the legal authority that allows a private homeowners association to detain minors and impose fines based on physical appearance. It's not about appearance, Thompson protested. It's about community health standards. Community health standards, Laura repeated, still typing. I see. And when exactly were these standards implemented? Rivera consulted his clipboard. 2 weeks ago. Approved by the community board in a unanimous vote. Unanimous. Laura's fingers paused on her phone. How many board members were present for this vote? All 5, Sterling said, her voice less confident now. And how many community members attended the meeting? The officers exchanged glances. Morse cleared his throat. Public attendance isn't required for board votes. But public notice is, Laura said, her voice sharp. Pennsylvania HOA law requires 30 days advance notice for any policy changes affecting resident access to community facilities. When was this notice provided? Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Luke watched his mother work, saw the way she commanded the space with nothing but knowledge and righteous anger. This was Laura Matthews, the prosecutor, the woman who had built a reputation for never losing a case she truly believed in. I'll take that silence as admission that proper notice wasn't provided. Laura continued, which makes any fines or penalties based on this alleged policy legally void. She looked directly at Luke. Sweetie, did these officers read you your rights before questioning you? No, ma'am, Luke replied. Did they inform you that you had the right to have a parent present during questioning? No, ma'am. Did they allow you to contact me immediately when you requested to do so? They made me wait until after they finished processing me. Laura nodded, her expression growing colder with each answer. She turned back to the officers, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Gentlemen, ladies, you have just admitted to multiple violations of Pennsylvania law regarding the treatment of minors in detention situations. This isn't detention, Sterling protested weakly. This is community standards enforcement. You physically restrained my son, transported him against his will to this facility, held him here for over an hour, and refused his request to contact his parent. Laura's voice rose with each point. That is the literal definition of detention. And you did it to a minor, without cause, based on discriminatory standards that violate both state and federal civil rights laws. Morse tried one more time to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Matthews, perhaps we can resolve this matter quietly. The HOA is willing to discuss reducing the fines in exchange for your son's agreement to use alternative community facilities more suited to his needs. The silence that followed was so complete that Luke could hear his own heartbeat. His mother's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went very, very still. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you just suggest that my son should be segregated from community facilities based on his physical appearance?" "We're just trying to maintain community standards," Rivera said quickly. "Community standards," Laura repeated for the third time. And Luke was beginning to understand that his mother had a habit of repeating phrases when she was about to destroy someone. "Let me share something with you about community standards. Officers." She pulled out her phone again and made a call. "Detective Rodriguez, this is Laura Matthews. I need you to run background checks on 4 individuals for me. Yes, it's urgent." She rattled off the officers' names while maintaining eye contact with each of them. "I also need you to pull all complaints filed against the Westfield Heights HOA in the past year. Yes, all of them. And Rodriguez, contact the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Tell them we may have a pattern of discriminatory enforcement." She hung up and smiled at the officers, who were now looking genuinely worried. The interesting thing about civil rights violations is that they're rarely isolated incidents. When you find one, you usually find others. And when you find a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, well, that's when things get very serious indeed. Thompson was the first to crack. "Look, maybe we were a little hasty. The kid seems nice enough. We could probably waive the fines this time." "Oh, you're absolutely going to waive the fines," Laura agreed pleasantly. "But that's just the beginning. You see, as a state prosecutor, I have a responsibility to investigate any evidence of systematic civil rights violations. And what happened to my son today suggests a much larger problem." Her phone buzzed. She answered immediately. "Rodriguez, what do you have?" She listened for a moment, her expression growing grimmer. "How many complaints, Jesus? And the background checks I see. Thank you." She hung up and looked at the officers with something approaching pity. "It seems you've been busy. 15 formal complaints in the past 8 months, all alleging discriminatory enforcement of HOA policies. And the background checks revealed some very interesting connections to certain political organizations with well-documented histories of discriminatory practices." Luke saw Morse's face go pale. Sterling was staring at the floor. Thompson looked like she was going to be sick. "Now," Laura continued, "here's what's going to happen. First, all fines against my family are being voided immediately. Second, you're going to provide me with copies of all HOA policies implemented in the past year, along with meeting minutes and voting records. Third, you're going to suspend enforcement of any policy related to resident physical characteristics, pending a full legal review." "You can't make demands like that," Morse protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can," Laura replied, "because I'm not making demands as Luke's mother. I'm making them as a state prosecutor investigating potential civil rights violations. And if you'd like to challenge my authority, I'd be happy to return tomorrow with a team of federal investigators and a warrant." The fight went out of Morse's shoulders like air from a punctured balloon. "We'll need to discuss this with the board." "You have until tomorrow morning," Laura said. "After that, this becomes a formal state investigation with all the media attention and legal consequences that entails." She turned to Luke. "Come on, sweetheart. We're leaving." As they walked toward the door, Luke felt like he was floating. His mother had just dismantled 4 adults with nothing but words and righteous anger. But as they reached the exit, Laura paused and turned back. "Oh, and officers. The surveillance cameras in this building have been recording our entire conversation. I trust you'll make sure those recordings are preserved. Tampering with evidence in a civil rights investigation is a federal crime." Outside in the parking lot, Luke finally allowed himself to breathe. His mother wrapped him in a fierce hug that smelled like her perfume and courtroom confidence. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, her voice soft now, the prosecutor facade falling away to reveal the worried mother underneath. "I am now," Luke said, and meant it. But Laura wasn't done. As they drove home, she made call after call, setting wheels in motion that would shake Westfield Heights to its foundation. Luke listened to his mother coordinate with federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and journalists. Each conversation building toward something bigger than just one afternoon's injustice. That evening, as they sat in their small kitchen, sharing takeout Chinese food, Laura looked at her son with an expression he'd never seen before. "Luke, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." "How often has this kind of thing happened? Maybe not as extreme, but people treating you differently because of how you look." Luke considered the question. "A lot, I guess, at school. Sometimes in stores. People stare or make comments. I thought that was normal." Laura's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be normal, and it's going to stop. 3 days later, the emergency HOA meeting was called. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with residents spilling into the hallway and parking lot. Local news crews had set up outside, drawn by reports of a civil rights investigation in the affluent suburb. Luke sat in the front row with his mother, watching as HOA Board President Margaret Whitfield called the meeting to order. The woman looked like she hadn't slept in days, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and strained. "We're here tonight to address recent concerns about HOA policies and their enforcement," Whitfield began, her voice shaking slightly. Laura stood up. "Mrs. Whitfield, before we begin, I need to inform everyone present that this meeting is being recorded for potential use in ongoing legal proceedings. Anyone who wishes to speak should be aware that their statements may be subject to legal review." A murmur went through the crowd. Luke saw neighbors he'd waved to looking uncomfortable, others whispering among themselves. Mrs. Patterson, who had seemed so approving at the pool, was notably absent. "Now then," Laura continued, "I'd like to share with the community some information that's come to light during the state's investigation into discriminatory practices by the Westfield Heights HOA." She walked to the front of the room, every inch the prosecutor. Over the past 8 months, the HOA has implemented 17 new policies. Of these, 11 specifically target behaviors or characteristics associated with minority groups, low-income residents, or individuals with physical differences. The murmuring grew louder. Someone in the back called out, "What kind of policies?" "I'm glad you asked," Laura replied, consulting her notes. Policy 23A restricts the use of community facilities by residents who don't meet certain physical fitness standards. Policy 31C requires additional fees for non-traditional family structures. Policy 45F prohibits urban-style music in community areas. With each policy, she read, the crowd grew more restless. Luke recognized the pattern his mother was building, the same methodical approach she used in court to construct an unassailable case. But perhaps most troubling, Laura continued, is the pattern of enforcement. Investigation reveals that these policies have been disproportionately applied to specific residents, while others engaged in identical behaviors faced no consequences. She clicked a remote, and a projection screen descended from the ceiling. For example, Mrs. Henderson, your son Jeremy has been observed diving in the pool in a manner that could be considered reckless. Yet he's never been cited for safety violations. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, your family gatherings regularly exceed noise ordinances, yet you've never been fined for community disturbance. The named residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Luke saw Mrs. Henderson's face flush red. However, Laura's voice grew colder. The Martinez family was fined 3 times for excessive noise during their daughter's quinceañera celebration. The Chen family was cited for inappropriate landscaping when they planted a traditional herb garden, and my son was detained and fined for the crime of swimming while overweight. The room erupted. Residents began shouting questions, some demanding answers from the board, others defending the policies. Through it all, Luke watched his mother maintain perfect control, letting the chaos build to exactly the right crescendo before raising her hand for silence. "The pattern is clear," she said when the room quieted. "This HOA has been systematically targeting residents based on their race, family structure, economic status, and physical appearance. This isn't about community standards. This is about discrimination, pure and simple." Board member David Sterling, Officer Janet Sterling's husband, Luke realized with sudden clarity, stood up. "These accusations are outrageous. The HOA has always operated in the best interests of all residents." "Have you?" Laura's smile was sharp. "Because I have surveillance footage that suggests otherwise." She clicked her remote again, and the screen filled with security camera footage from the pool area. Luke watched himself being confronted by the officers, saw the humiliation and fear on his own face. But the audio was the most damning part. Every cruel comment, every casual insult, every moment of unprofessional behavior was captured in crystal clarity. The room fell silent as the footage played. Luke saw neighbors he'd hoped to befriend covering their mouths in shock. He saw others nodding grimly, as if they'd suspected something like this was happening. And he saw a few faces that showed no surprise at all, only anger at being caught. When the footage ended, Laura faced the crowd again. "This is just one incident. We have similar documentation of discriminatory enforcement going back months. The question now is, what is this community going to do about it?" Mrs. Fitzgerald, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from Luke, stood up slowly. Her voice shook with age and emotion. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I remember when it was young families and old folks, when kids played in the streets and neighbors actually knew each other. What I just saw, that's not the community I helped build." Another resident stood. "I seconded the motion to approve those policies. I thought they were about maintaining property values. I didn't know they were being used like this." More voices joined in, some apologetic, some angry, some demanding action. Luke listened to his neighbors debate and argue and slowly, gradually, find their way towards something resembling justice. The final vote was overwhelming. Officers Morse, Sterling, Thompson, and Rivera were immediately terminated and banned from HOA property. All discriminatory policies were repealed. The board agreed to undergo comprehensive bias training and to implement oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. But Luke's mother wasn't finished. The HOA will also establish a community fund to provide sensitivity training, anti-discrimination education, and support for residents who have been targeted by discriminatory policies. The initial funding will come from the personal assets of the terminated officers, who are facing both civil and criminal charges for their actions. As the meeting wound down and residents began filing out, many stopped to speak with Luke and his mother. Some offered apologies. Others Thanks. A few shared their own stories of discrimination they'd witnessed or experienced. Luke began to understand that the problem had been bigger than just his own humiliation. He'd been one visible symptom of a disease that had been eating at the community for months. Mrs. Henderson approached with her son Jeremy in tow. The boy looked deeply uncomfortable, his usual arrogance replaced with something that might have been shame. "Luke," Jeremy said awkwardly, "I'm sorry about what happened at the pool. And about some of the things I said at school. My mom made me realize that wasn't okay." Luke studied the other boy's face, searching for signs of sincerity. What he found was a kid who looked as confused and uncertain as Luke felt most days. "Thanks," he said simply. "Maybe we could hang out sometime without the pool police around." Jeremy's smile was tentative, but genuine. "Yeah, I'd like that." As they walked home that night, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride in his community. Not because it was perfect, but because, when confronted with its flaws, enough people had chosen to do better. "Mom," he said as they reached their front door. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for fighting for me, for fighting for everyone." Laura wrapped her son in another fierce hug. "Always, baby, always." 6 months later, Luke dove into the community pool on a warm Saturday afternoon. The water felt perfect against his skin, and, when he surfaced, he saw a dozen other kids waiting their turn to jump in. Some were tall, some short, some thin, some heavy, representing every shade of human diversity imaginable. At the pool's edge, parents chatted comfortably while keeping one eye on their children. The conversation was in multiple languages, punctuated by laughter and the occasional shout of "no running." The Westfield Heights community pool had become exactly what it should have been all along, a place where everyone belonged. Luke treaded water for a moment, looking around at the scene. His mother was reading a book in a lounge chair, occasionally glancing up to smile at him. Officer Martinez, one of the new community security officers hired to replace the dismissed crew, was helping a small child who'd lost his goggles. Mrs. Fitzgerald was teaching her granddaughter to float, both of them giggling at the girl's determined efforts. This was what community looked like when it worked properly. Not perfect people in perfect houses following perfect rules, but imperfect humans choosing to build something better together. Jeremy cannonballed into the pool beside Luke, sending up a massive splash that drew mock protests from the other swimmers. "Race you to the other end," he challenged, his friendship with Luke having grown stronger over the months of shared community service and anti-bullying workshops. "You're on," Luke replied, and they swam off together through water that belonged to everyone. The weight of justice, Luke had learned, wasn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It was about the heavy responsibility of building a world where every person could swim in peace, where every child could cannonball without fear, where every family could find their place in the community they called home. As he touched the pool's far wall and heard Jeremy groaning about losing their race, Luke smiled and prepared to swim back through water that sparkled with possibility.